Many terrifying killers like Bluebird, Jack the Ripper, or Ted Bundy have practically acquired the status of a myth. Such villains personified their time to the same extent as any positive hero. In the last quarter of the 19th century, a man wandered around America. He will later become a similar legend who personifies pure evil. I'm talking about H. Holmes, Herman Webster Mudgett, otherwise known as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, is believed to be the first serial killer in the United States, possibly responsible for 200 murders, many of which were supposedly carried out in his hotel dubbed the Murder Castle on 63rd and Wells Street. His story and personality are fascinating because they symbolize the darkest impulses of that time. Aristocratic depravity, morbid sexuality generated by Victorian taboos, the appetites of a narcissist and a sociopath. Despite this, he was only charged with one murder of his partner Benjamin Petezel as part of an insurance payout scheme. Shortly after Holmes' arrest, he became a national sensation. Multiple newspapers published the names of his supposed victims at different times, such as Kate Durkee or Mary Kelly, only to later find them very much alive. In the 19th century, he was attributed to about 27 victims, but none of them could be directly traced to Holmes. Because these articles are full of fiction and based on the testimony of people who thought they knew or saw something, Holmes was accused of just about every missing person or unsolved murder in and around the Chicago area after his arrest for the murder of Ben Petezel. Many of these accusations were either quickly debunked or were never linked to him. Except for the death of Petezel, H. Holmes was never charged with anyone else's murder due to a lack of eyewitness reports, hard evidence, jurisdiction's limits, and the inability to find the victims of his supposed murders or their remains. But it didn't matter. He got a reputation as the most terrible villain of all time, and the name American Reaper. Over the last 130 years, H. Holmes' murder legacy has become more myth and folklore than fact. Examples would be like the demon barber of Fleet Street, Sweeney Todd, based on true stories but widely misinterpreted. These days, Holmes' story needs to be rewritten because it consists mostly of false information invented by historians and storytellers since the 1890s and is full of contradictions. When Holmes was arrested, people who simply wanted their 5 minutes of fame during the Holmes mania gave most of the reports and published articles. Even Holmes' autobiography, Holmes' Own Story, is not a reliable source of information. The editor and main promoter of the book, John King, said that he didn't add anything but noted that he couldn't swear to everything in that book was written by Holmes. And of course, not everything in it is true because Holmes wrote this book as an excuse for his crimes and, if not excluded, that significantly downplayed his guilt in it. Adam Selzer's book, H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, which was published in 2017, reviewing backed-up facts and information gives us a whole new perspective on this case. While H. Holmes was in fact a murderer, he was also a master manipulator and swindler. Energetic, enterprising, and supernaturally charismatic Holmes was pulling on numerous swindles with creditors, businesses, and insurance companies. Some of Holmes' earlier swindles can be traced before the construction of his murder castle. In regards to the castle, because Holmes owed so much money to creditors on the building, He often placed the property title in several people's names, such as his second mother-in-law, Lucy Belknap. A few other cases of swindling can be found, starting with a safe. The company had sold Holmes a large safe on credit that he had placed on the first floor and built walls around it. When Holmes never paid for it, the company came to repossess the safe. Holmes stated they were more than welcome to retrieve the safe whenever they wanted, but if they damaged the building, he would sue the company. Realizing that the safe company had to tear down the walls to remove it, the ultimate decision was made to leave the safe inside the building. Once, Holmes claimed he had come across an artesian well, which he sold as mineral water. In reality, Holmes had rigged a water pipe in the basement of his drug store, and with a slight chemical process, the water became discolored and sold readily as mineral water. There was also the gas generator scheme, where Holmes had created a device that looked like a wash boiler on stilts full of pipes, pulleys, wires, and taps. Holmes stated that his invention could generate gas from ordinary water. After the Lake Gas Company got wind of the device, they were prepared to offer Holmes around $2,500 for it. It would be discovered later that the gas generator was hooked up to their gas mains, which quickly ended Holmes' scheme. On August 13, 1893, a fire broke out the third floor of the unfinished Englewood building. Since no one stayed on the third floor that was still under construction, no one was harmed. Mrs. Lawrence, a long-time resident, stated that Holmes was on the third floor of the building moving things around. At 5 in the afternoon, he took the train for Wilmette. Soon after he left, there was a noticeable strange odor of burning tar, and tar began to run down the walls below. Days prior to the fire, Holmes and Quinlan, another resident, took off all the property from the third floor, such as the porcelain tub and all the marble basins. It was generally believed that Holmes was the one who set the fire to the building. Before a fire had broken out in the building, Holmes took out several different insurance policies on the property, but soon he learned it was too much to handle for him. By the end of October, the insurance companies were investigating him carefully. Holmes abandoned his building and began moving between apartments in several hotels before skipping town for good. Two swindles that Holmes pulled were the ABC Copier Company and the Campbell Yachts Company. Holmes created dummy corporation organizations so that the insurance policies on Holmes' Englewood Castle were not carried in his own name. He also created worthless promissory notes belonging to the Campbell Yachts Company, which he used to swindle unsuspecting victims. Just before leaving Texas, H. Holmes met with a man named E.B. Edwards of the Exchange Stable. Holmes had come across a team of black workhorses that caught his attention and offered to buy them with a $400 promissory note secured by property he had in a warehouse in Texas. Mr. Edwards agreed to take the note if he could convert it to cash. When the note was rejected, Holmes quickly came up with $375 in cash and ended up riding away with the horses. This was not the first deal Holmes had made for horses in Texas. Holmes, under the alias of O.C. Pratt, and his partner in crime, Benjamin P. Diesel, had bought several horses with worthless deeds and promissory notes and resold them for cash. The people of Fort Worth, Texas, became extremely angry, resulting in a grand jury investigation and indictment of Pratt. But by that time, Holmes had left town with all the money. Eventually, the horse swindling scam, guest drugstore scam, and the Fidelity Mutual Life Insurance scam, which resulted in one confirmed murder and 3 linked, would be traced back to Dr. H. Holmes. Holmes went to Four Courts Prison in St. Louis for fraud and stealing mortgage goods, where he met a train robber named Marion Hedgepeth. According to Hedgepeth, Holmes told him about how he had been paying a premium insurance policy on Petersell for some time and his plan to defraud a life insurance company. Holmes eventually offered Hedgepeth to be in on the insurance payout of Benjamin Petersell's death if Hedgepeth could provide Holmes with a dirty lawyer. Jephthah Howe eventually came into the swindle as a representative for Petersell. Those who knew about the scheme to defraud the insurance company were Holmes, Hedgepeth, Jephthah Howe, Ben Petersell, and his wife, Carrie. But instead of acquiring a corpse to pose as Petersell, Holmes was going to kill Petersell. Holmes initially hired Benjamin Petersell to work as a carpenter on the construction of his building. However, over time, the two began to cooperate, and Holmes trusted Ben to manage the construction site during his absence. Soon they became accomplices. In Philadelphia, Petersell operated under the alias of Mr. Benjamin Perry, portraying himself as a patent buyer. On September 4, 1894, an inventor named Eugene Smith, who was in a current business deal with Petersell, found his body and ran to get help. Days earlier, Holmes had killed Petersell by administering chloroform, which was easily obtainable for someone with a medical license. When Holmes arrived to kill Benjamin, he either found Petersell drunk or got him drunk and gradually administered chloroform, cutting off the supply of oxygen and eventually killing him without a struggle. Once Benjamin was dead, Holmes arranged the body to look like the whole thing had been an accident by breaking a bottle of benzene and placing a pipe near his body. To further stage the scene, Holmes burned the body's face and hair, making it appear as though an explosion had killed Ben. When the police and the doctor arrived to examine the scene and the body, they quickly noticed a few odd factors. The pipe Holmes had staged was deliberately placed near the body, and the pieces of the glass benzene bottle were found broken inward rather than out and away, as should have been the case in an explosion. As the autopsy on Benjamin Petersell was being performed in Philadelphia, Holmes traveled to the Petersell home in St. Louis, where he found the family in a terrible state after receiving word of Benjamin's death. It was decided that the oldest daughter, Alice Petersell, would go to Philadelphia to identify her father's body. Holmes assured Carrie that Benjamin Petersell was very much alive and in hiding, waiting for his family to rejoin him, and they would start a new life with the insurance money collected. Meanwhile, attorney Jephthah Howe drafted paperwork granting Holmes power of attorney over Carrie Petersell to collect the insurance money. At this time, Fidelity Mutual received a telegram from their Missouri manager stating that B.F. Perry, who was found dead in Philadelphia, was actually Benjamin Petersell. When Alice Petersell, Jephthah Howe, and Holmes met just before going to where the exhumed remains of Benjamin Petersell's body lay, they were joined by L.G. Foos, the president of the Fidelity Life Insurance Company, his assistant Olaf Forrest Perry, Dr. Alcorn, and the man who found Petersell's body, Eugene Smith. The group discussed identifying marks on Benjamin Petersell, still known as Ben Perry at the time. The next day, the same group headed to the cemetery where Ben Petersell's remains lay in a shed. While Alice remained outside, crying non-stop, the man inspected the remains. The skin had now turned black and was rotting. Dr. Mattern stated that he could not positively identify the body and that the scar on his leg was untraceable. Holmes stepped in and shoved where it should be in the wrinkled, rotten flesh. Dr. Mattern rubbed the skin away from the leg with his thumb to find exactly where the scar should be. The blackened thumbnail that Alice had pointed out was also removed. Petersell's body was flipped over, and the word Holmes had mentioned was removed with a lens and wrapped up in paper. Despite all the identifying marks being present, Alice still had to identify the body for legal purposes. Holmes tore a newspaper in half and placed it over Ben Petersel's face with a hole torn in the center so that only the teeth would be exposed. Alice only glanced at her father's teeth for a moment before saying, "Yes, those are Papa's teeth." The insurance company was satisfied. After Benjamin's oldest daughter, Alice, identified Petersel's body, an insurance check was written for Carrie Petersel. Holmes rushed back to St. Louis with the check in hand. Jeb Tahoe ended up taking $2,500 of the payout for his services, and after expenses, $7,200 went to Carrie Petersel, of which Holmes took all about $500, explaining that Benjamin had owed him $5,000 for a property in Fort Worth, Texas. Carrie didn't argue with Holmes and simply gave him the money. To be very clear, with the inflation of the US dollar over the years, $6,700 in 1894 was worth $236,000 in 2023. The killing of Ben Petersel set off a chain reaction, and Holmes went on to kill Petersel's children as well. As Holmes left the area with Georgiana, his new wife, and the remaining Petersel family, he was officially on the run. To make matters worse for Holmes, since Marion Hedgepeth didn't receive his portion of the insurance payout, he went on to tell the authorities about the insurance fraud. After the life insurance swindle was finished, an overwhelming 2 weeks began, during which Holmes' movements became so complicated that it was difficult to keep track of them. Holmes and Georgiana always traveled and lived separately from the children, and she never knew that he was transporting them around the country while traveling with her. So Holmes drove 3 parties all over North America. He and Georgiana were in the first, Alice, Nellie, and Howard Petersel were in the second, and Carrie, Daisy, and Lil Wharton were in the third. Holmes kept Carrie from knowing the true whereabouts of her children by telling her that they were with their father, and that eventually Ben and the children would meet her at the same location once everyone was safe from the authorities. There were actual times when Carrie and her children were within walking distance of each other, but no one but Holmes had any knowledge of that. Holmes, his wife, and the 3 Petersel children arrived in Cincinnati on September 28. He placed the children in a hotel and rented a small house for himself and his wife. During his short time in Cincinnati, it is assumed that he planned to kill Howard Petersel in the house he rented. A resident of the area who lived next door to Holmes stated that she saw Holmes and Howard Petersel arrive at the house with a furniture wagon and watched the 2 unload a large stove that was taken into the house. Holmes realized he was being watched and decided the next day to take the children to Indiana by September 30. By October 1, Holmes had put his wife at the Circle Park Hotel and the children a block away at the Hotel English. To suspend any suspicion, he went on to tell the Circle House hotel manager that he was the uncle of the children and that their mother would be arriving in a few days. In October 10, Howard became the first of the Petersel children to be murdered. Holmes was in Indianapolis on October 3 when he, along with Howard, first entered the repair shop and dropped off 2 cases of surgical instruments that he wanted to be sharpened. Later, he rented a cottage called the Lancaster House, telling the owner that it was for his sister. On October 8, while running back and forth from the Lancaster house to the different locations where Georgiana and the Petersel sisters were residing, Holmes had taken Howard with him to pick up the surgical tools he needed. On October 10, Holmes killed Howard Petersel and destroyed the remains. When Holmes returned to the Lancaster house later that night, he prepared dinner and the food was spiked with poison. After killing Howard, he took Alice and Nellie Petersel to Detroit, where he prepared to murder the girls. But something made Holmes abandon the house and leave the city. On October 18, H. Holmes went to Carrie Petersell and told her that Benjamin had left for Toronto to escape from detectives who were closing in on him. He said that Benjamin would be waiting for them there with Alice, Nellie, and Howard. Despite some protest, she eventually agreed to go to Toronto, thinking she would reunite with her husband and children. Holmes kept the Petersell family separated from each other and his wife. He purchased tickets for Georgiana and himself on the train, while Carrie and her 2 children traveled on a later train. Alice traveled by herself and arrived in Toronto. Holmes rented a quiet house at 16 Vincent Street in Irvington, which was owned by a Christiana Noodle. He claimed that he was renting the house for his sister. On October 24, Holmes went to Mr. Rives to borrow a shovel, saying that he needed it to fix the cellar to hold potatoes. The murder location of the Petersell sisters was set, and for several days the girls and their mother were in the same location without even knowing about it. As the girls traveled with Holmes, they had packed all of their clothes. Alice had a toy wooden egg with a spring-loaded snake inside, which was gifted to her by her father. The neighbor from whom Holmes had borrowed the shovel, Mr. Rives, was the last person to see the girls alive. While details of the murders are not entirely clear, it is suggested that Holmes simply poisoned the Petersell sisters. After the girls were dead, Holmes removed their clothing and buried them in a shallow grave in a cellar. The next day, Holmes returned the shovel he had borrowed from Mr. Rives. But Benjamin Petersell and his children weren't the only ones Holmes killed. Julia Connor was married to a jeweler whose full name was Nicholas L. Ned Connor. Ned was hired by Holmes to work in the jewelry store and eventually the drugstore on the first floor of the castle. He, Julia, and their daughter Pearl lived on the second floor of the Inglewood building. Julia was hired by Holmes to work as a cashier in the store, and soon after the doctor and Julia began an affair. Eventually, Julia and Ned divorced in the spring of 1890. While Ned cut Holmes out of his life, Julia became involved in many of Holmes' cluster of investments and lawsuits. Her name appeared on several suits and companies, such as the ABC Copier Company, and as a founder of the Chicago Intermediate Company. The last one was announced less than 2 weeks before Julia and her daughter disappeared. One swindle that Holmes played on employees was that he made them pay to the pretense of becoming a part owner of the store. On September 30, 1890, Julia gave Holmes a promissory note for $1,942, on which she only made a few payments in 1891. When payments had stopped, Holmes demanded the rest of the balance. She and Holmes argued bitterly regularly because of that money. The Crow family lived in Holmes' building from early 1891. They last saw Julia and Pearl alive on Christmas Eve, 1891. The Crows were in the Connors' apartment when Julia and Pearl were busy getting ready to travel for her sister's wedding in Davenport on New Year's Eve. By Christmas morning, someone had nailed a vacant board above the door to Julia and Pearl's apartment. The room remained unoccupied and untouched for about 4 months before the Dial family took over. Mrs. W. P. Dial told newspaper reporters that when Holmes took the family into the apartment, she saw all over the floor and chairs the clothing of Julia and Pearl Connor. Holmes casually kicked the doll lying on the floor by the bed and told the Doyles that Mrs. Connor and Pearl had suddenly left because Julia's sister was close to death. That was Holmes' sense of humor. In fact, she was getting married, which in his opinion was tantamount to death. The reasons behind Holmes killing Julia and Pearl are unknown. After his arrest, Holmes would deny killing them, and at other times he would confess to killing Julia while performing an abortion. It's possible that Julia did become pregnant with Holmes, and due to a lack of experience, he may have possibly killed her. But this raises questions about the fate of Pearl Connor. It's unlikely that he killed the little girl by accident. As for Ned, he assumed that Julia and Pearl left Chicago on their own to keep his daughter away from him. Ned wouldn't know about his ex-wife and daughter's disappearance until after Holmes' arrest, when he read about it in the newspapers. The next person on the list of assumed victims was Emmeline Cigarant. Emmeline came to Chicago looking for work around May of 1892 and was hired by Holmes as a secretary. The doctor told everyone that Emmeline was his cousin, although no one believed it. By midsummer, she was already his mistress, and by the fall of 1892, Emmeline expected Holmes to marry her. She hastened to tell the happy news to her relatives and friends. Holmes only insisted that she call him Robert Palps. Throughout the fall, Emmeline wrote letters to friends in Dwight, stating that she was engaged to Mr. Palps, the manager of the ABC Copier Company. The letters were full of admiration for the kindness and generosity of her fiancé, his wealth and position. Emmeline mentioned that they would go to Europe for their honeymoon and confessed to her younger sister that her betrothed was the son of an English lord whom they planned to visit during their trip. Perhaps they would even settle abroad forever. Who knows? Emmeline went so far as to order a tan-colored wedding dress. The last people who saw Emmeline on December 6, 1892 were residents of the Inglewood building and her friends, Dr. Lawrence and his wife. Mrs. Lawrence became a little worried and went to Holmes asking him about Emmeline's whereabouts. Holmes told her that Miss Cigarant had gone away to get married to Mr. Palps. The next day, after questioning Holmes, she saw him, Quenlin, and another man, presumably Petersell, struggling to carry a heavy trunk to an express wagon waiting outside the building. Mrs. Lawrence assumed that Emmeline had left for Lafayette. Emmeline's cousin, Dr. Cigarant, and Emmeline's parents both received notice that she had gotten married to Palps. Holmes even went so far as to have a wedding announcement published in the Lafayette newspaper on December 8, 1892. In late 1892, Emmeline's mother received her daughter's old trunk with much of her clothes inside. A letter from Emmeline stated that Mr. Palps was wealthy and had bought her a new wardrobe and new trunk. Shortly after Emmeline's disappearance, gossip spread in the Inglewood area that Holmes had gotten Emmeline pregnant months before she disappeared, similar to Julia Connor. However, we'll probably never know about what happened, as Holmes has never been convicted of the murder of Emmeline Cigarant since her body and whereabouts were never found. The next two supposed victims were Minnie and Nanny Williams. Minnie was a talented orphan girl who wanted to become an actress but eventually settled for a safer occupation as a stenographer in Chicago, where she crossed paths with H. Holmes. He employed her, using the woman and her name for scam schemes and swindles. Once Holmes learned that Minnie had inherited around $10,000 worth of property in Fort Worth, Texas, he saw great opportunities in her. After arriving in the East, Minnie began spending considerably money. Her signature reportedly appears on Campbell Yacht's paperwork on February 15, 1893. Minnie stamped the curt summons and signed it as M. R. Williams, secretary. Eventually, her sister Nanny Williams began receiving letters from Emmeline in the spring of 1893, stating that she was engaged to a wealthy doctor named Harry Gordon. Around that time, Minnie was beginning to become involved in Holmes' schemes. She hoped to make money from her collaboration with Holmes, as he was telling her how to dispose of real estate. Minnie saw in Holmes not so much a lover as a man who could save her from a life as a stenographer. She thought she could use him to resume her theatrical career, free from financial constraints. Minnie understood that the deals she was getting involved in were not entirely legal and that Holmes' real name wasn't Henry Gordon, but she didn't mind and entrusted her property to him. Of course, the ownership of Minnie's real estate in Fort Worth posed a problem for Holmes in converting it into cash. More than 700 miles separated him from the new acquisition. Another obstacle standing between him and the money was Minnie's younger sister, Nanny. Nanny arrived from Texas at the Inglewood building in June of 1893 after receiving an invitation from her sister to see the World Fair. Holmes moved Minnie and Nanny into a rented apartment in a house owned by Joseph Oker. On July 5, 1893, Oker saw the two women on Seminary Avenue taking a walk. That was the last time anyone ever reported seeing Nanny and Minnie Williams alive. Mr. Oker found the apartment that the Williams sisters were renting vacated with a letter from Henry Gordon stating that the women no longer needed it. Furthermore, a trunk belonging to Nanny arrived at the train depot but was never collected, resulting in the trunk staying in the Chicago Express office for more than a year. Not much is known about what happened to Minnie Williams after July 7. Holmes later claimed that Minnie Williams killed her sister in an intense argument and then immediately disappeared. Holmes was making plans to go to Fort Worth to claim Minnie's property. When Holmes was later charged for the Fidelity Mutual life insurance fraud, the location of the three missing Petersville children came into question. Holmes naturally lied about the children being in London, later changing the location to South America with Minnie Williams before her disappearance came to light. Frank Geyer was the detective who found the whereabouts of the Petersville children, traveling from Philadelphia to Chicago and then to Detroit, where he found the house Holmes had rented out and dug a grave in the backyard. In Toronto, Geyer connected with a detective Cuddy and spent a few days searching in the city with no luck. Toronto newspapers helped by giving much publicity to the case, which captured the attention of Thomas Rives, the man who lived next door to the house where the girls were killed. Frank Geyer arrived shortly after, showing Rives photos of the girls and of Holmes, and he identified them right away. On the morning of July 15, Geyer and Cuddy went to the home on St. Vincent Street where the current tenants, the Ambrose family, had been complaining of a foul odor coming from the basement. Mrs. Ambrose told the detectives that they had found some bits of clothing that had been partially burned with straw, and more clothing was found under the sink, along with a wooden toy egg with a spring-loaded toy snake inside that belonged to Alice Petersville. In the basement of the house, Geyer and Cuddy found a spot in the ground that was softer than the rest of the area. After digging about a foot into the ground, the stench that the Ambrose family complained about grew increasingly worse. At 3 feet deep, the two detectives found a bone that prompted them to call the local undertaker. An undertaker arrived as the detectives had finished digging up the two bodies. The girls were found to have been thrown into the grave naked, except for a ribbon in Alice's hair. Alice Petersville was found in the fetal position with Nellie Petersville on top of her sister, her hair covering her face. Both bodies were badly decomposed but showed no sign of physical violence. The deceased girls were carefully removed from their shallow grave, placed in simple coffins, and taken to the morgue for further investigation. Carrie Petersville arrived in Toronto on July 18, and by the next day she was brought to the morgue to identify the bodies of her daughters. With the bodies of the girls found, Holmes was no longer labeled as a swindler, con artist, and crook, but as a murderer. Investigators began looking at Holmes' infamous murder castle. John J. Badenoch, as a chief of police for Englewood, led to the investigation inside Holmes' building and interrogated suspects. By July 19, Badenoch picked Detective Sergeant John W. Norton and Inspector John E. Fitzpatrick to head up the search of the Englewood building under his direction. E.H. Robinson, the druggist inside the first-floor pharmacy, and jeweler Davis reported that there was a stench in the cellar that they had never smelled before. The two men took the inspectors into the cellar and threw out the rest of the building, showing them the safe in the back of the drugstore as well as the dummy elevator that ran from the third floor to the basement. Fitzpatrick suggested that the safe might have been used to mute or muffle the voices of anyone who may be locked inside. Everyone assumed that Holmes was hunting people in the elevator shaft. In one of the rooms on the fire-damaged third floor of the building, they found a large stove that had been installed 2 years prior to Holmes abandoning the building. When the current inspectors, Fitzpatrick and Norton, inspected the stove, they found charred bones, a watch, a chain, and bananas. The jeweler Davis immediately claimed he recognized the watch and chain, stating that he had repaired it for Minnie Williams. Unfortunately, the bones and watch chain were not enough evidence to convict Holmes of the murders of Minnie Williams, although it was now suspected that Holmes murdered and dismembered the body and attempted to burn her remains in the stove. On July 20, Chicago papers announced that Minnie and Nanny Williams had been burned to death and cremated in the stove. Norton and Fitzpatrick continued to conduct a thorough search, looking under the floors and in closets. They found a bottle of carbolic acid. A closer examination of the large stove revealed several more pieces that appeared to be bone fragments. As they left, reporters who had free range to wander through the building by invitation of the police took apart the stove to find what appeared to be burned human hair and bones. One doctor took the fragments to the lab and performed an acid test to settle the question if the fragments were bone. The results showed that they were simply hardened clay. Nevertheless, by July 22, the Englewood building officially earned the title of the Murder Castle. Crowds gathered outside the building to speculate, and in such large masses, the police had to hold them back. Newspaper reporters published stories about Bones' early swindles of Holmes and the murders. Soon they began to interview neighbors and prior residents of the building who realized they hadn't heard from Julia since 1891. On July 24, as the size of the basement workforce had been increased, one of the men in charge of the excavation uncovered what appeared to be bones in a bed of quicklime. There were 17 or 18 bones in all. Several appeared to be ribs, and one looked like a pelvis, and one perhaps was a jaw. Matted bits of hair and shards of broken bottles were also discovered, buried in the dirt basement. The bones were taken to a doctor in the drugstore who declared that the bones were of a human child between 6 and 8 years old. Pearl Connor had been around that age at the time she disappeared around Christmas of 1891. But officials didn't confirm that the bones had belonged to Pearl Connor since she had disappeared more than 3 years prior, assuming that if she was buried with a quicklime, it had deteriorated the body by the time the excavation team found it. Later in the day, another bed of quicklime was found under the stairs in the basement of the castle with what appeared to be another set of human bones, although the head and legs were missing. They were also considered as human bones. On the night of August 27, after searching in Detroit and Indianapolis, Detective Geyer, a team of detectives, and Inspector Gary of Fidelity Mutual finally located the remains of Howard Petersell. Detectives located a real estate agent who recognized Holmes' picture and directed them to the Lancaster House on Union Ave in Irvington, which Holmes had rented out. As the men arrived at the house, they spotted an old trunk beneath the porch. Carrie Petersell would confirm by telegram that it was her children's trunk after detectives had opened it up and asked her if it had been matted with a strip of blue calico to seal a crack. At once, the man went into the nearby barn at the Lancaster house and started digging for any remains they might find. After digging 3 feet deep, Geyer called for a stop, planning to regroup after dinner to begin an all-night search. Meanwhile, 3 local boys snuck into the Lancaster house and began searching the property out of curiosity. Moving from the attic, under the porch, and in the backyard to the cellar, they opened the flue that connected to the stovepipe. For whatever reason, one of the 3 boys put his hand inside the flue and pulled out a handful of debris with pieces of charred bones. Dr. Burnhill, who had been helping Geyer with the investigation, came back to the scene. After inspecting the bone fragments, they identified them as parts of a human skull belonging to a boy around the age of 10 to 12. After abounding the search in the barn, the man went into the basement of the Lancaster house, sifting through piles of cinders, soot and debris, separating bone fragments, bits of scorched cloth, buttons and other evidence such as crushed needles and teeth. The next day, more bones, teeth and bits of clothing were found in the cellar. A half-empty 2-ounce vial of cyanide was found in a container full of corn cobs and trash in the barn. In the house, a vial marked Aconitum napellus, wolfsbane, was found. Wolfsbane was used during that time period for fever treatments, but in large doses could be fatal and even kill almost instantly. It was clear to investigators that Holmes was responsible for the death of Howard Petersell as well. Emmeline Cigrand's name also resurfaced, but the only evidence they could possibly find was a possible footprint in the soundproof safe on the 3rd floor, which was installed around her time at the castle. A feminine footprint led to speculation that Holmes had locked a woman within the vault. Police also guessed that some sort of acid on the floor created fumes that led to a quick death while trying to kick the vault door open. With 9 assumed dead and missing people found to be linked to H. Holmes, he was no longer facing a conspiracy to commit fraud charge. He was now in a capital murder case with death by hanging as the punishment. The only death that Holmes was charged with at that time was Benjamin Petersell's, since his body was found in Philadelphia. Because the court didn't have jurisdiction outside of Pennsylvania, the rest of the murders would be considered irrelevant. Ultimately, H. Holmes would plead not guilty to the murder of Benjamin Petersell. The trial began on October 28, 1895, with Judge Matthew Arnold presiding over the proceedings. On day 1 of the trial, witnesses from Indianapolis, Toronto, Detroit, and other locations where Holmes and members of the Petersell family were seen together were present. Holmes came into the courtroom and was placed in the prisoner's dock. His lawyers were 2 attorneys in their mid-20s, Rowden and Schumacher. The prosecution team consisted of George Graham, who had been a district attorney for 20 years, and Thomas Barlow, one of the toughest lawyers in Philadelphia. Georgiana York, Holmes' 3rd wife, was present in the courtroom with a black veil over her face. After Georgiana had learned that he was a bigamist and his 2 other wives were never officially divorced, and the evidence of murder was now stacked against Holmes, she came to show him that she wanted nothing to do with him. Since Holmes felt that his lawyers were too inexperienced, after the first 3 jurors had been selected, he got permission from Judge Arnold to act in his own defense. Holmes cross-examined the jurors himself. By the time the jury selection process was finalized, Graham made his opening statement by laying out the case, telling the whole story as he believed it happened, from the discovery of Benjamin Petersell's body to Holmes' movements in the fall of 1894, with 3 parties who were unaware of each other's presence. Graham also announced that he could prove that Holmes had killed each of the 4 Petersell family members who were not alive to testify. Carrie Petersell arrived at the courtroom and waited for her testimony to be heard. She testified that she had not heard or seen her children since Holmes was on the run until she identified her girls in the morgue, breaking down and crying in the courtroom. Holmes sat unmoved and silent. The final day of the trial took place on November 2, 1895. By 9 p.m., the jury re-entered the courtroom after 2 hours of deliberating with the verdict of guilty. Roughton and Schumacher asked for another trial, which was granted on November 18. But on the day of the hearing, when Schumacher tried to enter new evidence, the witness who allegedly saw Benjamin Petersell alive, Graham exposed his plot and Schumacher was arrested on the spot for perjury. There would be no retrial for H. Holmes. On November 30, Judge Arnold pronounced the sentence. Herman W. Mudgett, alias H. Holmes, I have nothing further to say to you beyond what is contained in the opinion I have just read. There remains nothing for me to do but to proceed and pass the sentence which the law has imposed, and that is that you be taken hence to place from whence you came, and from thence to the place of execution, and there hanged by the neck until you're dead, and may God have mercy on your soul. Holmes was sentenced to death on May 7, 1896. While waiting for his execution, Holmes was given several offers to write a confession about the truth behind the murders and his actions. On April 5, a confession from H. Holmes was announced by the New York World, which was published and revealed that Holmes didn't just kill the 9 people he was rumored to have, but 11 more as well. However, the announcement of the confession Holmes had written was almost entirely false. For example, in that confession, it was stated that Holmes had killed Patrick Quinlan, who was still alive. Around the same time as multiple newspapers were offering Holmes for a confession, he was also receiving many offers for his corpse after the pending execution. Holmes told the reporters from the Philadelphia Press, I know this is a curious world, but people who presume to be intelligent have demonstrated their barbaric predilections. Here are over 100 professional men clamoring for a chance to mutilate my body. They want to secure parts of it to experiment on and gratify their own curiosity. It is my legal right to protest against any post-mortem examination being performed on me. I have written instruction for Mr. Rodan to see that no unnecessary outrage shall be committed on my body. Holmes eventually wrote a different confession to the newspapers, which he gave to writer James Elverson of the Philadelphia Inquirer. In this confession, he claimed to have killed student Robert Leacock, his friend from the University of Michigan Dr. Russell, Julia and Pearl Connor, and listed many other victims, several of whom had never been identified. However, some of the people he mentioned were still alive, and many others were known to have died from natural causes. When asked about his confession to the newspapers, Holmes replied, "The papers wanted a sensational story, and I gave it to them." Indeed, Holmes' growing reputation as a supervillain could be his own latest and greatest scam. Holmes also tried to act as though he was insane by calling Geyer back to Moyamensing prison. When Geyer arrived, he found Holmes had pasted small sheets of yellow paper all over his cell with strange symbols and characters, claiming, "This is my horoscope, prepared by myself. You cannot help but see now that you're wrong in your deductions. You must not admit that I am not a murderer. If you will only study up the constellation under which I was born and the favorable signs of the zodiac point to my death, a natural one, you will see. Oh, I'm not born to hang." On May 1, Holmes made his last effort to avoid facing the gallows by writing to Carrie Petersell's lawyer, begging her to appeal to the governor to give him 5 extra weeks to settle his affairs. However, Carrie Petersil had never made such a request to the governor. When the day of execution, the gates outside opened at 10 o'clock to those who had tickets. The door to Holmes' cell opened, and he was escorted up to the scaffolding where a noose was placed around his neck, and he was dropped 5 feet downward. Originally, Holmes had no desire to make a last statement before his death, but as he stood looking at those present, he changed his mind and said, "Gentlemen, I have very few words to say. I would make no remarks at this time were it not for the feeling that if I didn't speak, it would imply that I acquiesced in my execution. I only wish to say that the extent of the wrongdoing I am guilty of in taking human life is the killing of 2 women. They both died by my hands as a result of criminal operations. I also wish to state, however, so that there will be no misunderstanding hereafter, that I am not guilty of taking the lives of any of the Petersil family, either the 3 children or their father, Benjamin Petersil, for whose death I am now being hanged. I never committed murder. That is all I have to say." After kneeling down and praying with the priest, Deputy Sheriff Richardson handcuffed and placed a black hood over Holmes' head, followed by the noose around his neck. At the wave of Richardson's handkerchief, which was the signal for the gallows to operate, Holmes dropped 5 feet below the scaffolding. However, his spine didn't break and Holmes began to die from suffocation. It took 15 minutes for Holmes to be pronounced dead, as the physician on site checked for the sound of a heartbeat every so often. Holmes remained in the noose for 30 minutes before the physician on site gave permission to lower the body. The incredible sense of mystery surrounding Holmes persisted long after his execution. In Chicago, a crowd gathered around the castle on 63rd Street, wondering if something strange or supernatural was going to happen. It seemed like a good night for the ghost to appear. Holmes' body was taken behind the undertaker's residence to be prepared for burial. As per his wishes, 10 inches of wet cement were poured into the coffin. Holmes' body was placed on it and more cement was added. Before that, the priest placed a cross on his chest with the name and date of death. Holmes' coffin was taken to the Holy Cross Cemetery in Yeadon, Pennsylvania, to await burial the next day. Before Holmes' death, he had bought a double white plot requesting to be buried 10 feet deep. His grave was unmarked. For the next few days, crowds of onlookers came to the cemetery to see the burial place, but soon the novelty faded. Holmes' sensational story also left the front pages. The Holmes story found a new life with books like Herbert Asbury's Game of the Prairie, later titled The Chicago Underworld. It was one of the first books published on Holmes years after his death, long after the hype of the Petersil case was almost completely forgotten. It contains passages that began the idea that Holmes had killed possibly hundreds of people, while in reality he was linked only to as high as 9. Ashburn also stated the idea that H. Holmes had a torture chamber in his basement filled with the bones of all his victims, a medieval torture rack, and various pieces of apparatus which, resembling medieval torture racks, were never satisfactorily explained. Another source of the H. Holmes myth was John Bartlow Martin's article published in Harper's Magazine titled The Master of the Murder Castle, a classic of Chicago crime. It tells about the acid pits and the false reports of Holmes killing up to 200 people as they traveled to Chicago and stayed in the hotel dubbed the Murder Castle. However, the building was never used as a hotel during the Chicago World Fair. John Martin's article states that Holmes killed for scientific experiments to satisfy a strange lust simply for pleasure. But in reality, when his victims were no longer of any use to him, such as Emmeline Cigrand and Julia Connor, or if they became a possible liability, like the Petersall children and Pearl Connor, he killed them as discreetly as possible. Regarding the book Devil in the White City by Erik Larson, the plot is about Holmes being a mad genius who murdered countless women and tortured them in the basement of his successful hotel during the World's Fair. What a lot of people don't realize is that in the endnotes, Larson wrote that a lot of the information came from his imagination and the patterns he discovered in profiles of modern serial killers. So overall, with H.H. Holmes, well over the last 140 years, he grew to become one of the deadliest serial killers with a thirst for blood, a criminal mastermind who was able to create a murder hotel for his own sick fantasies. In reality, he was just a murderer who killed 4 people and most likely killed 5 others, as well as a crook, and a pathological liar, a scoundrel, a swindler, and a con artist with a list of lawsuits. In 1898, rumors swirled around Inglewood that H.H. Holmes had survived his execution and was now growing coffee in San Paranaribo, South America. These rumors circulated until 2017, when what Holmes had feared happened. Archaeologists exhumed his remains at the request of descendants. The curators in charge of the physical anthropology collection at the Penn Museum were called in to assist with the identification of the remains after Jeff Mudgett, the great-great-grandson of Holmes, won a judge's permission to have the grave exhumed. 8 feet down, the team found a well-preserved wooden box, but it only contained a few pieces of scrap wood. Specialists were frustrated at that point. The next day, the team began probing beneath the bottom of the false coffin and found the lid of a second box. This was the true coffin, and it was indeed encased in concrete. Workers finally opened it to find mostly decomposed human remains still clad in the waistcoat, leather boots, and a bowler hat. Holmes still had his mustache and cross on his chest. A tissue sample was sent to King's College in England, where a laboratory specializing in testing ancient DNA confirmed that the remains belonged to a relative of Jeff Mudgett. The exhumation order required that he be returned to his grave, so on August 31, 2017, Holmes was laid to rest for the second time, now in a new white coffin without cement. I want to believe that no one will ever disturb the peace of His Excellency H.H. Holmes anymore. The castle caught fire in 1894 and the building was mostly destroyed, except for the salvageable first floor. It was converted into a sign store and bookstore until it was sold again in 1937. Then it was torn down and used to build the Inglewood post office that stands there today. In conclusion of his biography, Holmes writes, "I wish to say that I am but a very ordinary man, and to have planned and executed the stupendous amount of wrongdoing that has been attributed to me would have been wholly beyond my power. And it seems true to me." Thank you for watching my young detectives. See you next time. Bye.